Okay, so getting started with the first problem here. Basically, we have an array list that's filled with 4 values. We have a couple variables that we're going to identify here, and hopefully by looking through the trace table, we'll be able to answer question B, which is about like what's the purpose of this thing. So variable 1 is 100. Variable 2 is going to be 0, and then we'll start into our loop where I is going to start at a 0. Nums.size, so that's just like how big is the array list, should be 4 here. So basically, we're going to loop through this. We're going to do 4 loops here. Start with 0, 1, 2, 3, and then we'll be done. So 4 total loops here. Looks good? Okay. All right, so to begin with, we'll check and see, is var1 bigger than nums.getI? I thought nums.getI would be a good thing to pull out here, just to keep track of like what number we're looking at. So to begin with, we're looking at number 3. Okay, so if var1 is greater than the value at nums.getI, then we'll set var1 to be equal to nums.getI. Okay, so well, var1 is definitely bigger than numbers.getI, so we'll change this value to 3. Good. Okay, we're working our way down here. var2, if var2 is less than nums.getI, then var2 is going to be equal. Okay, well, we're updating this value 2 to be 3 as well. 2 to be 3. Now we're going to get finished through this loop. We'll go back to the top. I is going to be 1 now. And now, since our index now value is 1, we'll retrieve the value 7. And again, we haven't output anything so far. That's fine. We'll run through here and we'll say, okay, was var1 greater than nums.getI? No. So we're not going to run this code. So we'll leave this as 3 for this loop. We'll go through here. var2. Is var2 less than nums.getI? Is 3 less than 7? Yes. Okay, so we need to update this value. And now we're good. We'll go back to the top. I will now be 2. Let's see. So nums.getI 2 should be 1. Mixing up the numbers in there, but okay. So var1, is var1 greater than nums.getI? Yeah, 3 is greater than 1, so okay, this value become 1. And then we'll run through here. var2, is var2 less than the value at getI? No, so okay, this stays at 7. And then I is going to increase to 3. Are we almost done? This might be our last loop, right? Because we're going up to, as soon as we get 4, this loop's going to stop. So var1 is, okay, so nums.getI here for the last value in 3. When I is 3, nums.getI should be 4. Okay, so we'll look through here. Is var1 greater than nums.getI? No, we'll stay at 1. Is var2 less than nums.getI? No, 7. Okay, so we get down, basically what's going to happen to this, and it is an important thing to include here, is that I will turn into 4, because at the end of the loop, I will increase, but now we come back to check, and we'll see, okay, well, I is no longer less than 4, so we'll be done. So our output is going, so having this value in here, the 4, I think is pretty important. Just to know, like, that's when our value will stop. And we're going to print out 1, 7. Okay, so that's how the trace table should look. Now, the second question is asking, what is the purpose of this algorithm? Well, what you should see here is that the purpose of this algorithm is to find the smallest and the highest value. Eventually, we ended up with the smallest value in var1, and we ended up with the largest value in var2. And that's why initially these values were set, the var1 was set really high, because we want to find a really large number and then see if, and then reduce it each time to find the smaller and smaller value. Right? We start out with, well, that's 100. It looks like 160. I think my keyboard might have jumped on me. Starts out with 100, okay, and then we kind of find smaller and smaller values. Every time we find a smaller value, we update this. Same way var2 starts out with 0, and then every time we find a larger value, we increase. It doesn't change every single time because we don't always find smaller or larger values. Is there any one where neither one change? I guess just right away, neither one. Well, no, I guess in every one, at least one of them's changing, right? Oh, no, okay, so sorry, going from the third one to the fourth one, this value didn't change because we already found the lowest and the highest value. So that's the purpose of this, is to find the highest and lowest. All right, moving along to question number 2. Oh, wrong pen. Consider the variables. So this one's a little bit trickier, I think, because we'll have to deal with there's some kind of weird stuff going on in here. So let's take a look through this. Oops. Okay, so I updated this table to make it a little bit more, I think, easier to follow. Like, I personally, like, originally the table only had these 1, 2, 3, 4 things. I added these other ones because I think it's really helpful to, like, look at this and try and analyze, like, what's going on and figure out, like, what kind of decisions are getting made here. So we'll start with, I'm going to start with loop 0. I don't think you'll see a lot of problems like this on the test, but it's a style problem, like, just doing loops like this. And I'm going to say, like, that's, like, our beginning. Before we even start the loops, 3, 2, and we won't analyze these quite yet. Well, Well, no, I guess we can analyze those right to begin with, and then we'll decide whether we're going to enter. It's hard. I mean, yeah, it's hard to do this always in a table. I think there's a lot of different ways. I could like analyze these right now, or I'm going to add it onto this next line here. So as I go into loop 1, var2, is var2 equal to 0? Is var2 not equal to 0? That's true. And then var2 divided by var1. And now remember, this is integer division, so 3 divided by 2 should be 1.5, but we'll cut off that 0.5 and just be 1. Is 1 greater than or equal to 0? True. So then we're going to update our values. var1 is going to increase by 1. var2 is going to decrease by 1. Okay, so 1. And now we're going to enter our second loop. We'll assess right at the top, is var2 not equal to 0? Yes, it's not equal. var2 divided by var1 should be 4, and that's still greater than or equal to 0. True. And so we'll update our values, and var1 is going to become 5, and var2 is going to become 0, and we'll start our loop. Now the important thing is going to happen right here, while var2 is not equal to 0. So immediately this becomes false. And so what's like a slightly interesting thing about Java, and just, I don't know if it's available in other languages, but this is going to just totally stop. Like, we're not even going to evaluate this end statement. As soon as 1 is false, like, the Java's not going to waste its time checking the other statement. Like, if var2 is not equal to 0, okay, well, definitely this whole thing is going to evaluate to be false. So we'll exit the loop here, and we'll just update the values down here. So var1 is, I won't write out the whole thing, but we should get an output of 5, 0. And it should say var1 is 5, var2 is 0. But that will be the result for this one. Okay, so moving into the last set of problems here. This is a class. I mean, I think this is a pretty good test question where we have a student, they have their name. I mean, okay, so looking through this, I'll make a slightly longer video explaining what's going on here just in case. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking about the class itself and then moving into the actual problems. So if you already feel like you're comfortable with how this class works, just totally skip on to the next actual question explained. And there should be links down at the bottom in the YouTube thing. So yeah, I mean, just what this is. This is a public class. So we are just basically making a student class. And the student could be, so we might use that to, like, if we want to create like a registrar of students, and we want to kind of store all the students' data into into like an array list or into some sort of way of storing. And two basic things you might need, like if we're going to keep track of you, probably two very basic things we would need is like a name and your ID number. So what we're going to do, we have declared these two things, and we could add a bunch of other stuff in here, right? I think we talked about this before. Like, we could add GPA in there. We could add in, I mean, there's a million different things that you could add in based on your unique situation. But in this case, we're adding in two variables. So we have these variables for the name, and then a string for the name, and then an int for the ID number. This is the declaring class variables. And what's nice about this is that when we declare them up here, like, these are they're inside the class, but they're not within any methods. So we have access to name and ID number in any of these other parts of the code because they're declared in the class. So it's really important to declare these at the top. Okay, into here, we're going to get into, this is the constructor. And this is like constructor because it's going to build something. It's going to help us build our object. And so and this might go down into question A, when we declare a student, so for example, well, I'll just answer question A right here. If we want to make student, and it says the object's name, student object's name is Vihan, and ID number is 1234. We could name this object whatever we want. It might make sense to call it Vihan, but we could also do it like student A. Doesn't really matter. Student A is equal to new student. And then, like, okay, so we have this, we've said, okay, there's a student out there. We're naming the object, it could be whatever we want, we'll just call it A. And then what we're going to do is we'll say new student, and then we're going to pass in information that we want to store about this student. Oh, and I'm going to run off screen here. Let me move this over a little bit. We pass in the new student, Vihan, and then we'll pass in their ID number, which should be 1234. And now we've created a Vihan, we've created an object called A, and it's storing this data about the student Vihan1234. So, like, this value, these values are getting sent into the constructor. And like the constructor is, I mean, the student object is sitting there waiting, and it's waiting for you to add values to make it complete, right? And this is where you're adding those values. It's got a missing part, right? It's got a namespace, it's got an ID space. But when we first create the object, it's empty. We need to fill up those values and like store those values in our object. And that's what we're doing right here. We're storing vhan into the class, into our object, and we're taking the pin, or excuse me, the ID number, and storing it into the object. So now this object is created and it has values. It exists and it has values. So that's what the constructor is doing. And this order is really important here. The first thing, whatever we enter in first, will go into here. And so we have like this string n. We'll use n actually inside the constructor to set up these values. Let's see here. We have our name is coming from, like, the name is coming from the blueprint, from the setup for the class. That's how we know there's something out there called name. And then we're initializing it to be equal to whatever gets input into when we make the object. Same thing here, ID number. And then, I don't know, I'm drawing like crazy lines all over here. But just trying to make sense that, like, when we define the class, we have these kind of blank spots for name and for ID number. Whenever we make the object from the class, we need to fill in those values. And that's what we do right down here. Okay, so that's the role of the constructor there. Then kind of already answered question A. So let's move on into question B. Let me see, what else can I do in here? We have some methods here. So I guess, yeah, kind of getting into B, C. And is there a D or just B, C? We have, these are all individual methods that exist in the class. So for example, later on, I should be able to access the vhan. Well, actually the student's name is, the name of the object is A. So if I want to access the name of the object, I might say A dot get name. And what that should do is return a value to me. It doesn't have to print anything, it's going to return it. So what I need to do in part B is to, return the user's name. And this actually is super easy. All we need to do here, just back up 1 second here, like, this shouldn't print, this should return the name. So if we wanted to print it, we might do something like this and say system out print a.getName, and that's going to print out the student's name. So all we would need to do here for B is we just need to return the name. That's it. And that's going to return, we have the value stored, whatever the student's name is, we stored it in name, so we just need to return that. And now we have a fully functioning method. A.getName will return this to the user. And let's move on into the next one. So the next one's slightly different. You don't need to know this for the test, but like we often have getters. Actually, I'm not going to go into that, but there are getters and setters. I won't go into super detail, but like get means to get a value, set means to set a value. So we might get the student's name, or in this case, we're going to set the value. Getters and setters, just like a really common thing. That's, you might see this kind of get name, set ID, get ID, right? So getters, getting something versus setting the value. Moving into C though, we need to go through and change the student's ID number based on a value that gets put in. So the way we might use this is like, okay, we have student A. I'm drawing with the wrong pen. Let's see, I need to really create some space here. What we might do here, okay, let's just put this a little bit higher here. So what we might want to do is change A's ID number. We put it in wrong. It wasn't 1, 2, 3, 4. That seems like a pretty bad ID number. Let's set it to be a little bit more realistic. And we'll give him a, I don't know, ID number. So now we're going to change the ID number. Currently, this isn't going to do anything because, yes, it's set up to take in a value, but we're not adjusting anything. So all we need to really do here is just say ID number is equal to n. And what we're doing is we're accessing this ID number that already exists within the object. We already have that defined. We already have that variable out there. We just need to update its value. So that's all we would do here. ID number is equal to n, and that updates the value. So this is really the answer to C. This is the answer to B. This is the answer to A. And now let's finally, I need to delete some space. But this one is really basically the same thing as some of the previous ones we've done. And let's just make sure I drag this over here. Um, it's very similar to like get name. The only difference is that the header is not totally complete. So that means the header refers to this stuff. So we have get ID in here, and we don't really need to have any parameters in here. This should just like return whatever the user's or whatever the object's ID number is. All we need to do in here is whenever we're using a class, we should start by saying public. We don't need static in here to be clear. Um, well, there's too much detail for that. Get ID, and now we need to decide like, okay, should we be returning something to the user? Well, I mean, the question says we need to return the user's ID number, so yes, we need to return something in here. What type of thing? Well, it's going to be an integer. So we need to public int get ID, and then in here, so we just need to return the user's ID. So we'll say return, and then we'll say ID number. Okay, and that's really it. We just need to add in the public and the int part in there, and then return the ID number. Now, if we run code like a.getID, that's going to just return whatever the current user's whatever the ID of the current the current ID of the user that you're talking about. So you can see this like, I don't know, like if you have, I don't know, when I was normally at schools they have like a student ID with like a barcode and you might scan it. You could use some sort of interface like that to return values, like to figure out the student ID, or if you modify this code a little bit, like you could enter in the ID into a database or something and then return the user's name. That would probably be really useful. It's not implemented here, but we're not that many steps off of doing that. Like get name from ID. So you enter in the ID number and then it should return the name. You could do something like that. It'd be a little bit higher level to introduce that, but it is something to think about. Like it is something you could do for an IA project. Classes are a big part of what your IA is going to be. So hopefully this makes sense. Hopefully we hit all the important points, and good luck.